Section 3 of A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A History of the Inquisition of Spain, Volume 3, by Henry Charles LEA. Book 6, Chapter 7, Part 3. It was a universal law that torture should not endanger life or limb, and, although this was often disregarded when the work was under way, it called for a certain amount of preliminary caution to see that the patient was in condition promising endurance, caution admitted in theory but not always observed in practice. When there was doubt, the physician of the Inquisition was sometimes called in, as in the case of Rodrigo Perez at Toledo in 1600, who was sick and weak, and the medical certificate that torture would endanger health and life sufficed to save him. But the Suprema was not so considerate when, in 1636, it ordered the Valencia Tribunal to torture Joseph Pujal before transferring him to the hospital, as was done afterwards on account of his illness. Pregnancy has always been deemed a sufficient reason for at least postponing the infliction, but the Madrid tribunal, in Instructions of 1690, only makes the concession of placing pregnant women on a seat, in place of binding them on the rack, while applying the exceedingly severe torture of the garrote, sharp cords, 2 on each arm and 2 on each leg, bound around the limb and twisted with a short lever. Hernia was regarded, at least in the earlier time, as precluding torture, and I have met with several cases in which it served to exempt the patient, but in 1662 the official instructions of the Suprema ordered that no exceptions be made on that account, save the omission of the trampazo vigoroso, which causes downward strain. In the other tortures a good strong truss suffices to avert danger, and it should always be kept on hand in readiness for such subjects. In accordance with this, the Madrid tribunal in 1690 orders for hernia cases the use of the seat provided for pregnant women. As regards women who were suckling, there seems to have been no established rule. In 1575, when the Valencia tribunal proposed to torture Maria Hilo, the physician who was called in reported that it would expose the child to imminent risk, and the purpose was abandoned. In 1608, however, at Toledo, when the same question arose in the case of Luisa de Narvaez, the consulta voted in discordia, and the Suprema ordered her to be tortured. Besides these generalities, there were occasional special cases in which torture was abandoned in consequence of the condition of the patient, heart disease, excessive debility, repeated faintings during the administration and other causes. The physician and the surgeon were always called in, when the prisoner was stripped, to examine him, and they were kept at hand to be summoned in case of accident. The tribunal seemed to have been more tender-hearted than the Suprema, which, in its Instructions of 1662, reproved inquisitors who avoid sentencing to torture on account of weakness or of a broken arm. This, it says, is not proper, because it forfeits the opportunity of obtaining confession in the various preliminaries of reading the sentence, carrying to the torture chamber, stripping him, and tying him to the trestle. Besides, after commencing, the torture is always to be stopped when the physician so orders. There was another salutary precaution, that there should be a proper interval between the last meal and the torture. About 1560, Inquisitor Cervantes says that the patient is not to have food or drink on the evening before or on the morning of the infliction, and in 1722 a writer specifies 8 hours for the preliminary fasting. In the administration of torture, all the inquisitors and the episcopal representative were required to be present, with a notary or secretary to record the proceedings. No one else save the executioner was allowed to be present, except when the physician or surgeon was called in. In the earlier period there was some trouble in providing an official to perform the repulsive work. An effort seems to have been made to compel the minor employees to do it, but with doubtful success. Ferdinand, in a letter of July 22, 1486, to Torquemada, complains that the inquisitors of Saragossa had employed a torturer because the messengers had refused to do the work, and he suggests that the messenger be discharged and the torturer serve in his place without increase of salary. If this cannot be done, the salary should be reduced. No salaried torturer appears in the payrolls. The duties were not constant, and doubtless when wanted proper functionaries were called in and paid, but there is suggestiveness in a letter of Ferdinand in 1498 ordering the restoration of a certain Pedro de Moros, who had been dropped, to serve as messenger and for such other duties as the inquisitors might order, at 500 sueldos a year. At one time the alcaide of the prison seems to have been the official torturer, for in 1536 the Suprema writes to the inquisitors of Navarre that if their alcaide is not skilled in the business they must find someone who is, and not work the implements themselves, as they seem to have done, for it is not befitting the dignity of their persons or office. In 1587 at Valencia we hear that the messenger and portero served as assistants, and the Suprema ordered the work to be entrusted to a confidential familiar. Eventually, however, the tribunals employed the public executioner of the town, who was skilled in his vocation. When in 1646 at Valladolid Isabel Lopez was ordered to be tortured on November 23rd, the alcaide reported that the public functionary was absent and the time of his return was uncertain. The torture was necessarily postponed, and on the 27th Isabel took it into her head to confess and thus escaped the infliction. In Madrid, from March to August 1681, Alonso de Alcala, the city executioner, was paid by the tribunal 44 ducats for 11 torturings, at 4 ducats apiece. It seems strange that objection should be made to the torturer being disguised, but in 1524 the Suprema forbade him to wear a mask or to be wrapped in a sheet. Subsequently he was permitted to wear a hood and to change his garments, and, in the 17th century, a mask and other disguise were permissible if it were thought best that he should not be recognized. At every stage in the preliminaries, after reading the sentence, taking the prisoner down to the torture chamber, calling in the executioner, stripping the prisoner and tying him to the trestle, there was a pause in which he was solemnly adjured to tell the truth for the love of God, as the inquisitors did not desire to see him suffer. The exposure of stripping was not a mere wanton aggravation, but was necessary, for the cords around the thighs and arms, the belt at the waist with cords passing from it over the shoulders from front to back, required access to every portion of the body, and at the end of the torture there was little of the surface that had not had its due share of agony. Women as well as men were subjected to this, the slight concession to decency being the zaragüeyes or paños de la vergüenza, a kind of abbreviated bathing trunks, but the denudation seems to have been complete before these were put on. The patient was admonished not to tell falsehoods about himself or others, and during the torture the only words to be addressed to him were "Tell the truth." No questions were to be put and no names mentioned to him, for the reason, as we are told, that the sufferers in their agonies were ready to say anything that was in any way suggested and to bear false witness against themselves and others. The executioner was not to speak to the patient or make faces at him or threaten him, and the inquisitors should see that he so arranged the cords and other devices as not to cause permanent crippling or breaking of the bones. The work was to proceed slowly with due intervals between each turn of the garrotes or hoist in the garrucha, or otherwise the effect was lost, and the patient was apt to overcome the torture. It was a universal rule that torture could be applied only once, unless new evidence supervened which required purging, but this restriction was easily evaded. Though torture could not be repeated, it could be continued and, when it was over, the patient was told that the inquisitors were not satisfied but were obliged to suspend it for the present, and that it would be resumed at another time if he did not tell the whole truth. Thus it could be repeated from time to time as often as the consulta de fe might deem expedient. The secretary faithfully recorded all that passed, even to the shrieks of the victim, his despairing ejaculations and his piteous appeals for mercy or to be put to death, nor would it be easy to conceive anything more fitted to excite the deepest compassion than these cold-blooded, matter-of-fact reports. As for the varieties of torture currently employed, it must be borne in mind that the Inquisition largely depended on the public executioners, and its methods thus were necessarily identical with those of the secular courts, while even when its own officials performed the duty, they would naturally follow the customary routine. The Inquisition thus had no special refinements of torture and indeed, so far as I have had opportunity of investigation, it confined itself to a few methods out of the abundant repertory of the public functionaries. In the earlier period only two tortures were generally in vogue, the garrucha or pulis and the water torture. These are the only ones alluded to by Pablo Garcia, and both of them were old and well established forms. The former, known in Italy as the strapado, consisted in tying the patient's hands behind his back and then with a cord around his wrists hoisting him from the floor with or without weights to his feet, keeping him suspended as long as was desired, and perhaps occasionally letting him fall a short distance with a jerk. About 1620 a writer prescribes that the elevating movement should be slow, for if it is rapid the pain is not lasting. For a time the patient should be kept at tiptoe, so that his feet scarce touch the floor. When hoisted he should be held there, while the Psalm Miserere is thrice repeated slowly in silence, and he is to be repeatedly admonished to tell the truth. If this fail he is to be lowered, one of the weights is to be attached to his feet, and he is to be hoisted for the space of 2 Misereres, the process being repeated with increasing weights as often and as long as may be judged expedient. The water torture was more complicated. The patient was placed on an escalera or potro, a kind of trestle, with sharp-edged rungs across it like a ladder. It slanted so that the head was lower than the feet, and at the lower end was a depression in which the head sank, while an iron band around the forehead or throat kept it immovable. Sharp cords called cordeles, which cut into the flesh, attached the arms and legs to the side of the trestle, and others, known as garrotes, from sticks thrust in them and twisted around like a tourniquet till the cords cut more or less deeply into the flesh, were twined around the upper and lower arms, the thighs and the calves. A bostezo or iron prong distended the mouth. A toca or strip of linen was thrust down the throat to conduct water trickling slowly from a jarra or jar, holding usually a little more than a quart. The patient strangled and gasped and suffocated, and at intervals the toca was withdrawn and he was adjured to tell the truth. The severity of the infliction was measured by the number of jars consumed, sometimes reaching to 6 or 8. In 1490, in the case of the priest Diego Garcia, a single quart satisfied the inquisitors and he was acquitted. In the Mexican case of Manuel Diaz in 1596, the cordeles were applied, then 7 garrotes were twisted around arms and legs, the toca was thrust down his throat, and 12 jarras of a pint each were allowed to drip through it, the toca being drawn up 4 times during the operation. In the Toledo case of Marie Rodriguez in 1592, the operation was divided, the cordeles being applied while she was seated on the banquillo, and were given 8 turns. She was then transferred to the trestle, and the garrotes were used, followed by the water. At the second jarra she vomited profusely. She was untied and fell to the floor. The executioner lifted her up and put on her chemise. She was told that if she would not tell the truth, the torture would be continued. She protested that she had told the truth and it was suspended. For 9 months she was left in her cell. Then the consulta de fe voted to suspend the case and she was told to be gone in God's name. It was probably not long after this that these forms of torture gradually fell into disuse and were replaced by others which apparently were regarded as more merciful. In 1646 the Suprema applied to the Tribunal of Cordova for information concerning the garrucha and silla and for a description of the trampa and trampazo which it used, with an estimate of their severity. The tribunal replied that the silla had been abandoned because it could scarce be called a torture and the garrucha on account of the danger of causing dislocations. For more than 30 years the tribunal, as well as the secular courts, had discontinued its use, as also the brazier of coals, heated plates of metal, hot bricks, the toca with 7 pints of water, the depiñoncillo, escarabajo, tablillas, sueño, and others. The methods in use were the cordeles and garrotes, of which there were 3 kinds: the vuelta de trampa, the mancuerda, and stretching the accused in the potro or rack. The letter proceeds to describe at great length and in much detail these somewhat complicated processes. In abandoning the pulleys and the water jar, the patient gained little. He was adjusted for torment by a belt or girdle with which he was swung from the ground. His arms were tied together across his breast and were attached by cords to rings in the wall. For the trampa or trampazo, the ladder in the potro had one of its rungs removed so as to enable the legs to pass through. Another bar with a sharp edge was set below it, and through this narrow opening the legs were forcibly pulled by means of a cord fastened around the toes with a turn around the ankle. Each vuelta or turn given to the cord gained about 3 inches. 5 vueltas were reckoned a most rigorous torture, and 3 were the ordinary practice even with the most robust. Leaving him stretched in this position, the next step was the mancuerda, in which a cord was passed around the arms, which the executioner wound around himself and threw himself backward, casting his whole weight and pushing with his foot against the potro. The cord, we are told, would cut through skin and muscle to the bone, while the body of the patient was stretched as in a rack between it and the cords at the feet. The belt or girdle at the waist, subjected to these alternate forces, was forced back and forth, and contributed further to the suffering. This was repeated 6 or 8 times with the mancuerda, on different parts of the arms, and the patients usually fainted, especially if they were women. After this the potro came in play. The patient was released from the trampa and mancuerda and placed on the 11 sharp rungs of the potro, his ankles rigidly tied to the sides and his head sinking into a depression where it was held immovable by a cord across the forehead. The belt was loosened so that it would slip around. 3 cords were passed around each upper arm, the ends being carried into rings on the sides of the potro and furnished with garrotes or sticks to twist them tight. 2 similar ones were put on each thigh and 1 on each calf, making 12 in all. The ends were carried to a maestra garrote, by which the executioner could control all at once. This worked not only by compression but by travelling around the limbs, carrying away skin and flesh. Each half round was reckoned a vuelta or turn, 6 or 7 of which was the maximum, but it was usual not to exceed 5, even with strong men. Formerly the same was done with the cord around the forehead, but this was abandoned as it was apt to start the eyes from their sockets. All this, the Cordova tribunal concludes, is very violent, but it is less so and less dangerous than the abandoned methods. These remained practically the tortures in use. In 1662 the Suprema, in ordering the Tribunal of Galicia to continue the torture of Antonio Mendez, called upon it to report as to its manner of administering torture. Its answer of May 13th shows that it was using the mancuerda and potro, though after a somewhat primitive fashion. To this, by order of the Suprema, Gonzalo Bravo replied, May 22nd, with elaborate instructions, especially as to the trampazo, indicating that substantially the methods described by Cordova were recognized officially. Galicia appears to have puzzled over this until September 19th, when it apologized for its lack of experience and asked for detailed plans and drawings of the form of potro required. It is fairly presumable from all this that thenceforward these new methods were adopted in all the tribunals. End of section 3. Recording by Shena Ser, Fresno, California.